Chapter 10. Alice Explores. Whatever private doubts Alice had about her brother's ability to convince three extremely shaken gentlewomen of his sanity and good intentions, they didn't interfere with her decision to track down the senior members of the household and to question them ruthlessly. The valet, the housekeeper, and the upstairs maid all seemed to have been given some kind of playbook, enough to empower them to give instructions to a pair of bewildered siblings who appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the night. Had they been through this before? How many times? The valet seemed a little shaken by the thought that Brian might die without his medication, but did that mean anything more than the choice of Brian the groom had not been thoroughly researched? Not that Brian wasn't worthy of love or romance, she thought as she peeped into a series of spooky rooms, but Alice couldn't picture her brother as a wish-upon-the-star type for whom this time trip would seem like a dream come true. From the way Brian was swinging between hysterical panic and cosmic despair, she would guess he wasn't comfortable with his approaching doom either. Alice realized that she didn't know what her brother would wish for as a best-case scenario if he could, beyond the obvious, stay alive and get back home. The thought startled her, because she had always taken it as a given that she knew him better than anyone else. If he did wish, she thought, it wouldn't be for anything in these rooms. They were clearly unused and unlit. The furniture huddled in the center under dust covers, and the walls creaked eerily when she passed through. Brian and she had been masters of game night ever since they were kids. They could play the heck out of charades and Pictionary, and Alice reassured herself that their current strategy of divide and conquer was going to bring them to victory now. Her brother might have to step it up a bit to carry off his apologies, but he had never gone in for the escape room fad, and this was a doozy. Alice was really looking forward to the "Tell us what you think" comment card when this was over. Nice costumes, no cell service, 1 star, she muttered to a dusty and abandoned still room at the end of the hall. Would not recommend. She slammed the door closed with a bit more force than was necessary. For a moment, it felt good, but only for a moment. Then, her customary good nature asserted itself. "Oh, sorry," she said to the door. "You're probably a perfectly good castle, and none of this is your fault." As always, when she talked to inanimate objects, her mind automatically began a playback of her ex-husband's bored, disdainful sing-song, "It can't hear you," exactly as if it had been shouted from the sofa, where Lance would have planted himself to watch TV. But damn it, that was then. She had kicked his sorry ass to the curb. The divorce was final. Alice was single, and if she wanted to talk to a chair, or the carpet, or the wallpaper, she was going to. And if time travel had made her lady of the house, then as lady of the house, she was going to say sorry to the doors all day long. "I'm sorry," said Alice more firmly, and gave the still room door a slight pat. "I think you are a wonderful castle." And, after a slight pause that her personal past would have been taken up by another disparaging comment from the ex, she strode down the hallway to continue her exploration, accompanied only by the sounds of her swishing skirts and the settling house. Clearly, it behooved a nosy person to snoop around, and it behooved a clever person to make use of the conventions of the time and circumstances to smooth her path. Alice considered herself to be the perfect nexus between nosy and clever, and she had promised to use her skills to find out all the details so that Brian and she could get back home in time for Insolent. Where she was now, there were dozens of hallways, which made sense. The servants had to be able to go anywhere, even in a castle. Alice had a pretty good sense of direction, but it was put to the test as she backtracked from the still room to one of the more modern sections of the maze, one with a very Tudor feel to it, and in one of the big rooms found what she'd hoped to see, a green cloth door. The door opened easily despite an ominous creak. Ah, Alice smiled grimly. "Ha," she murmured. "That sounded like you were telling me to look here." She mimicked the creaking of the door. "I swear, I almost thought you were talking to me, Carl." She went down some stairs. They ended at another door, and on the other side was what looked like to be an old-timey garage, adjacent to the carriages, and Alice felt fresh, if chilly, air blowing from outside. She hadn't been in this house long, but she felt like already there ought to be some curtains billowing somewhere decoratively. As if to compensate, the floor creaked invitingly as she crept forward. "Gotcha," she whispered. Because there was the valet, here in the depths of the castle. The shape of the roof and the open air transformed the occasional creaking of the house into an almost constant muttering, and Reginald Shield, looking decidedly less formidable with his coat removed and his shirt sleeves rolled up, was muttering right along with it. Beside him were a series of trunks and boxes stacked against the wall. In their ordinary state, the luggage looked like as if it were simply stored there, waiting for some journey, presumably to London or Paris or some long sea voyage. Alice wondered if they had been pulled out as props for "These two people have just arrived from the colonies" story that Miss Pocket told her was going around. Whether this was the case or not, the luggage had now been shoved aside, revealing a bewildering array of jars, each with a curved steel crazy straw stuck in the middle of its lid. The straws were all connected to copper wires, which led to a metal pole running up the center of the wall, where the doorway opened to the air. Alice was pleased that the jars and the muttering servant all had an appropriately Frankensteinian feel to it. Obviously, this was the machine at the root of their time travel, and if she was a bit disappointed it was in some spiffy, glowing, high-tech monstrosity, it had plenty of zap and sizzle. The whole wall behind the jars and the metal pole was soot-stained, pitted, and showed signs of acid corrosion. Whatever the device was intended to do, the look of the wall and the muttering of the valet indicated that it wasn't doing it properly. Reginald stood and ran a hand over his forehead in a weary way. Alice, sympathetic to headaches, felt a rush of solicitude. The valet was younger than she'd guessed in her first impression of him, and seemed more of a sad genius than a mad genius. "What is that thing?" Alice asked, just the tiniest bit gratified when Reginald jumped and turned around with a startled expression. He said, as he smoothed his face and visibly braced himself for yet another encounter with another Latimer. It's a collection of Leyden jars. Alice was disappointed that he was being reasonable. She would have preferred if the valet had, in the style of any good mystery villain, thrown himself in front of the peculiar device, trying to pretend that it didn't exist. Then she could have flung her accusations at him in the steely way she'd always imagined she was capable of. She would have wrenched the real story from his trembling lips, and she and Brian would have gotten home well before his deadline. Unlimited soup, salad, and breadsticks at Olive Garden to celebrate. Alice was not immune to demon theater, but unlike Brian, she kept her performances largely to herself. Unfortunately, no one had told the valet he was meant to be the villain in this or any other piece. Alice thought he looked tired rather than malicious, and given his helpful tone, she felt she had to be nice. She had been looking forward to being the bad cop and felt cheated. She settled for, "Leyden jars, eh? Did you build them or find them?" "I built them, Miss Latimer," was the bland reply. "Alice," she said, relieved to go back to the more comfortable state of being the good cop. "Please, Mr. Shield." "Reginald," he said with a small friendly smile, "at least when none of the other servants are around."
"Reginald," she agreed. "Listen, I can tell you're not a native too." She hesitated, not sure what phrase best expressed the likelihood that this guy, like herself and her brother, had been sent from another place and time. "To these parts?" he offered. She smiled just a little and nodded. "That's right." "No," he said, "I wasn't born in England, and I'm from the future of this place, like yourself. But I do have a tad more experience with the circumstances than either you or your brother." "Well, we just arrived last night," said Alice. "You couldn't possibly have less." "That's fair," he said. "But the thing is, I came from the 20th century. He looked at her expectantly and seemed just the teeniest bit disappointed when she didn't gasp or swoon. "I was an electrician, hopefully, and then, with the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration." "So what is it you've built?" asked Alice, indicating the apparatus around him. "Leyden jars?" "Leyden jars, my lady." "Alice," she corrected him automatically. "Alice," he replied. "Basically, they are sort of a rechargeable battery. It was invented around half a century before this time, so I thought it wouldn't be too shocking if anyone saw me tinkering with it now." "Pun intended?" asked Alice, and it was Reginald's turn to look blank. "You know, electricity, shocking." "Oh yes," understanding dawned, and he chuckled. "No, definitely an unintended pun. Honestly, this is just a bit of maintenance." He gestured to the neatly arranged jars. "I've observed that the arrival of a new person coincides with a lightning storm, but this is the first time two people have arrived at once. I was afraid the surge would be too much for my system to handle. But with one thing or the other, I haven't had a chance to get down here yet and repair the breakages." She followed his gesture to where some broken glass had been swept into a tidy pile. "It looks very sci-fi," she said, and when he looked blank again, added, "Science fiction?" "Ah," said Reginald, "Flash Gordon."
I enjoyed those comic strips immensely. I can certainly promise if you're a fan of that sort of speculative story, I've managed to fill the castle library with as many examples of space and time travel stories as I could find. It's only a pity there should be so few, but neither Mary Shelley nor Jules Verne have been born yet. The library? Said Alice. I thought you were the valet. Alice must have looked as puzzled as she felt, because Reginald gave her a subtle grin. When I arrived, I was given the wardrobe of a young footman and a note that said I had just 3 days to find a certain book in the castle library and deliver it to a certain place. Unfortunately, at the time, the library was in disarray and lacked any semblance of a system of organization, let alone a catalog. I worked day and night, but was interrupted more than once to tend to other duties, and 3 days is not a lot of time. So you didn't find the book, said Alice softly, and didn't go home. How long were you? She trailed off, not sure whether she wanted to use the word sent or trapped. 7 years, said Reginald, answering the implied question without waiting for a verb. However, I've never been really the sort of person to give in to despair. I might have been destined to live out my days in a century other than my own, but I decided I was going to finish my task as best I could. I thought my instructions had been so vague, there might be a workaround. His grin grew, and Alice thought his eyes had a very mischievous twinkle in them. So I kept up my work, organizing the books, cleaning them, setting them in order. I enjoyed reading, and in the library I discovered there were several descriptions of the Leyden jar as a device to capture electricity. But why? Asked Alice. What could you need for it out here?
Because it was my job, Reginald said, bringing electricity to rural areas that didn't have it yet. I figured that even if I were to return to my home, that journey would require some form of power. I was more than a little familiar with the idea of the lightning rod, though I never expected to be in a position where I could conceivably run into its inventor. I built these over a course of a year, he indicated the jars with evident pride, and used the lightning rods of the castle to conduct the energy here to where it can be stored as electricity. Alice's knowledge of electrical history was pretty much confined to an image of Benjamin Franklin, a kite, a key, and a storm, but she nodded as if she understood the implied details. But I'm confused, Reginald. You've been storing power for years now, and I don't guess that the glass and acid and whatnot are easy or cheap to come by in this day and age. There have obviously been some accidents, she indicated the scorch wall, and as if in response, the wind shifted and she clearly smelled the acid smoke. What are you doing with all the power? Nothing, the valet admitted. He looked around the room thoughtfully, and Alice followed his gaze. Not yet, but I've been in this time long enough to see there's no rhyme or reason to who comes to the castle in these storms. I was hoping that eventually the travelers who arrived would be from the far-flung future, perhaps from an era where time travel is known. I thought if such a person were to come here, I could help them fashion a device to take them back to their own time. I thought such a mutually beneficial partnership would be enough to convince them to bring me with them and drop me off in my own time. That's so sad, said Alice impulsively. You shouldn't have to persuade someone to free you from a trap. The valet gave a little bow, as if conceding the matter or declining to argue. Please don't feel sorry for me, he said. In the context of the 19th century, I'm very well off. I've food and shelter and employment. It's just... You miss your home? Guessed Alice. For a moment, a puzzled expression crossed Reginald's brow. I don't even know if it's that, he confessed. I enjoyed my work in those days, but I was a young man. I have no family who will be missing me back in that time. Instead, it's a sense of, well, wrongness. He shook his head, frowning. Something is not as it should be in the castle, and my only guess is that it stems from those of us who are out of alignment with our proper eras. He gave Alice a questioning look. I don't suppose that you or your brother happen to be time engineers of any kind? The idea of Brian, or her, crafting a time travel machine caused Alice to give a brief snort of laughter and shake her head. No, but I'm hoping, she said. Reginald's face fell. I thought not, he sighed. But one day, perhaps someone will be sent with that knowledge, and when we do, I will be ready with something to power that device. So, you're going to continue your experiment? Alice asked, even though you've no way yet to use the power? One has to do something, my lady, Reginald said simply. I've cleaned and dusted the shelves of the library, catalogued its contents, and organized the books according to the late dowager's every whim. I was only promoted to valet when your brother arrived, but before that I had ample opportunity to search for the book I was told to find long after the 72 hours were over. And did you find it? She asked. No, he said. I never did, but one has to do something, he repeated, and Alice heard his bleak despair. The bitter smell of burnt wood filled the room. Alice felt ill. She realized how well and truly hopeless their predicament was. There wasn't anyone here who could help them get home. The Latimers were on their own, but Alice knew now that if she did not find a way back, as she was determined to, she meant to take all the other time travelers home with her. How many were there? She would find out. She needed to find all the clues she could in the castle. And Brian? Brian really needed to make good on his apologies. End of Chapter 10 of Lord Latimer's Ladies. Written by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin, and read by Dan McLaughlin.